You are listening to the History of Aviation podcast with Derrick, Beeler, David Rowe, and David Gorman.
Hello and welcome to the History of Aviation podcast. I'm Derrick Beeler. Thanks for making us a part of your day. In this episode 19, we're going to be covering the French Nieuport 11, 17, and 24. Aviation enthusiast, plane spotter, graphic designer, Mr. David Rowe. How's it going, David?
Things are going very well. It's a busy week for me here. I had a little airplane fun yesterday. I took my daughter to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and dropped her off for a flight to Dallas, where she was lucky enough to sit down in an Airbus A380 and fly to England last night. She arrived about 4 hours late, but she got there this morning about 7:30 a.m. our time here on the East Coast of the United States, and been watching her travel up the English countryside to her castle that she's staying at. It's a literal castle, and she's been sending pictures. It's unbelievable. It's like the Biltmore House, but English. So it's beautiful. So she's in England. My son graduates from college this weekend. So I'm going to be spending the next 2 or 3 days in Knoxville with some awards banquets and graduation. And so I have been a busy guy and am going to be busy for several days to come.
Sounds very much like it. Aviation enthusiast, plane spotter, science teacher, Mr. Dave Gorman. How's it going, Dave?
Hey, Derrick. Hey, Dave. Things are going well. Not anywhere near as exciting for me as Mr. Rowe there, but been doing pretty well. We've been dissecting frogs this week, so it's a highlight of 7th grade science, and glad to finally be there. Kids did really, really well. Only had 1 or 2 kids that said they felt a little queasy, but they powered through, so that was good.
Good deal. Getting
ready to go up to Kentucky this weekend to see my mother. It is her 95th birthday 1 week from today, so we're going to be celebrating Imelda Gorman up in Hopkinsville. So looking forward to that, and just some good family stuff. Staying busy with things, about to wind down the school year. So looking forward to some talk about this extremely rare aircraft, but one that made a big impact in the era over Europe and the First World War.
Yeah, absolutely. This is probably the Nieuport made by the French. It's a biplane. To me, it's kind of the quintessential World War I biplane. It's the look. It's simple, small, very nimble biplane fighter with the big rotary engine in the front. So when I think of a World War I aircraft, this is the kind of plane that I think of, is the little Nieuport, the little scout fighter.
Well, you mentioned about it being nimble, and there's video that's old and black and white and everything showing Nieuports that are just kind of floating and flipping and fluttering in the air and highly maneuverable. But there are none of these still airworthy, of course. And I think, Dave, I saw there was just a single original example of this that's still available for people to see. So an extremely rare aircraft.
As a matter of fact, that is my background image. It is in Brussels, in Belgium. It is the only original Nieuport left. However, there are numerous replicas out there that are like 7th, 8th scale up to full scale. So you can actually see a replica flying. I think the old Rhinebeck Airdrome in New York, in Rhinebeck, New York, they actually fly a Nieuport 17 in some of their air shows. So those are all replicas, but if you want to see one, yes, you can find one. But if you want an original, you got to go to Brussels.
Now you can see some restorations or some recreations rather on display. I think the Air Force Museum in Dayton has one that is painted up as the hat and the ring group, that the American escadrille that was flying in World War I. But I actually did see a couple of replicas fly about 30 years ago at a great air show that I happened to stumble into. My friend Len Rudolph invited me to go down to Gunnersville, Alabama. and they had a couple of original World War I aircraft. They had some recreated aircraft, including one that was starred in the movie The Blue Max. Several of these 7/8 replica Nieuports. So it was really, really cool. And, they flew and they were nimble, and, you couldn't really tell they were that different size-wise or anything. I think on the video that I have that's on my YouTube channel, there actually is a Nieuport that ground loops when he comes in. He was okay, but it's the first time I'd ever seen that happen before. Made it kind of exciting. But a tremendous plane, and as I said, David, coming in, thinking about what you said about being so nimble. Good engine, good flight characteristics, strong wings, quite a design, and one that, for its time, for a little while, it was a formidable opponent.
Absolutely. I was going through the notes on this, and the Nieuport company, man, they absolutely pumped out a lot of aircraft. They started out with a Nieuport 1, and I think they got up to like a Nieuport 74 or something. I mean, the numbers, they were constantly innovating, creating new planes, and so this line just grew and grew as technology changed. The company started out with just wire-braced monoplanes, just, very simple, that early design. And they quickly realized that wasn't going to work, and they switched over. They got a new designer, a Gustave Delage, who was their chief designer in 1914. And he built up this sesquiplane. If you remember that term from our previous podcast about the albatross, yes. That's an airplane that has a large wing on top and a smaller wing underneath. That reduces some of your drag, makes it very nimble and easy to turn. It also gets some inherent weaknesses in the structure because it is a smaller wing. And the other thing is you get the distinctive V struts. So this one is technically a V strutter, with the wings being connected by the two wooden struts. So they just created the classic design, and they just kept improving on it. And, again, these things were changing constantly. They would be in combat for, a few months, and then they would be replaced with something bigger and better. So it happened fast then.
So I know that this plane saw a lot of design updates and upgrades and things over time. When did the Nieuport 11 first show up?
1916, I believe.
So I know the 17 showed up in 1916. I think the early design though was not pre-war, was it?
No, it actually.
Go ahead.
They were working on it, but it didn't come out until the war started. And I think like the Nieuport 10 and 11 were only in combat for about 2 or 3 months before they were supplanted by, a 14 or a 15 up to the 17. So they were very quickly in service and then relegated to training units. So it was a fast turnover for this aircraft.
Well, there was so much. The learning curve, of course, was so steep at that time because aircraft were, were they for observation? Were they for, spotting? Were they for transport? What were they going to be used for? And so the idea that you'd have fighter aircraft that were going up and shooting down enemy aircraft, patrolling and keeping your lines clear of aircraft overhead, all that kind of stuff was really quickly evolving over time. And so it seems to me like if you look at a plane that was considered a military aircraft in 1912 and compare it to a military aircraft in 1917 or 18, that was incredible, that the things that they had to develop and learn about in terms of strength and engine power and armament, shooting through the propeller, the interrupted gear, all of those types of developments. So, the fact that this aircraft was built by the French, and they didn't have a fantastic aircraft industry, I don't think, at that time, but they were definitely up for challenges and learning as they went and upgrading as their pilots became more skilled, they were demanding better aircraft and seeing what things were necessary to survive in the air.
Yeah, absolutely. This, as a matter of fact, the Nieuport 11, when it came out, it was the plane that put an end to the Fokker scourge. So you had all these Eindeckers that were out there shooting down all the Allied planes, and the Nieuport was the one that came into service and put a stop to it. It was capable of, shooting them back down and regaining control of the air. And so that lasts for probably a year or so before, the Albatross comes out and some of the Fokker D7s start showing up, and they take back control of the skies. So it was this constant, I'm going to improve, you're going to improve, new equipment. And it was just an unending cycle of development. So yeah, they just, they kept making them better every time they could.
And, there were, with that technology, I mean, you had aircraft that were being shot down and recovered behind enemy lines and being dismantled, and secrets learned, and adjustments being made, and planes that were improving because sometimes they were using technology that had been discovered and implemented by the opposing side. I know that there were some Nieuports that were captured by the Germans, and I think that they actually built some themselves and called it something else, of course.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. There were two different companies in Germany that, they're not license built because they didn't have a license, but they built them. They just, made their own. We'll do it ourselves.
Well, you see that happen sometimes when people are in a hurry to catch up technology-wise. So take advantage of those opportunities. So what do we know about the engine that just the engine development that went into the Nieuport, size-wise and power-wise? I mean, it always seems that, you have airplanes that are chasing more powerful engines. And this one, I had the sense, was built for existing engines that were plenty powerful. Is that correct?
Well, yes, they 80, 90 horsepower is where they started out. So not huge engines, but at the time that was pretty powerful. The Nieuport 17 came along and it started out with 110 horsepower Lerone 9J. And then that one moved up to 120 horsepowers. Then they moved up to 130 horsepower Clégier 9B, a 9-cylinder rotary engine. So it was just a constant. As the new engines came on, they'd strap it to the front and move it up. All rotary, of course, but, just 130 horsepower is about the highest that I've got for the Nieuport.
So, and the rotary engine, that was the first time, that air show I went to in Alabama, first time I'd seen aircraft with rotary engines. And it was, I wasn't quite sure what I was looking at first. The cylinders are rotating. And, the guys in the cockpit were, they were covered with scarves and goggles and things to keep the flying oil, out of their face and on the windscreen and things like that. But I mean, it was a real thing that was happening with some of those rotary engines. Quite neat.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. They apparently they leak like crazy, and that castor oil goes everywhere. So yeah, that's, not only are they trying to stay warm with all the garb, they're trying to protect themselves from, being covered in oil. Tough flying back in those days.
So what were some of the roles that the Nieuport played? I mean, it was a combat aircraft, and it was somewhat successful with some aces being made in the cockpit of a Nieuport.
Yeah, there were quite a few aces. Obviously it's a scout fighter, so it would go out and, chase the enemy down. It was used for bomber escort. I know it did some reconnaissance work. So pretty basic stuff for them. At one point they actually strapped rockets to the struts, some Le Prieur rockets to attack observation balloons. I've got one of the aces had like 21 balloon kills. So, I mean, not only are they fighting, other aircraft, they're chasing balloons. So a little bit of everything.
Goodness. We were talking before we came on the air about some of these aces, and I was perfectly willing, David, to let you make an effort to pronounce those names. You want to give it a shot, and I'll help
I'm
you?
ready. I'm ready.
Oh, goodness. Well, let me nah, it's going to be an ugly thing, so just hang on a second here.
I'll throw that one over to you. I've got some names here too.
So all right, here we go.
I'm sure we have the same list.
Yeah, I probably do. So French aces, I have a Georges Gunnemeyer with 54 victories, Charles Negussier with 43 victories, Maurice Boyot with 35 victories. This is the fellow that had the 21 balloons shot down. Armand Pinsard with 27 victories, and Rene Dorme, not sure, 23 victories. Man. Probably, yeah, exactly.
That's really impressive. Again, you're thinking about these were nimble but fragile aircraft, and it probably didn't take a whole lot to bring them down. But some of these guys probably had several missions a day, and might have even gotten shot down, landed, and gone back up and to fight again.
Yeah, speaking of that, there is an Albert Ball, who's a British pilot. He would fly alone. He would just get in the plane and go searching for the enemy on his own. So this is back when, it was pretty much seat of your pants. You didn't fly in formation or anything. You just got out and went searching for trouble. And, obviously Albert Ball had 44 victories, so he definitely got that. Another very famous Canadian ace is Billy Bishop, who had 72 victories. So,
oh my gosh.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of people, Eddie Rickenbacker flew the Nieuport as well. So, I mean, there's some pretty big names. Here's a really good name. Have you ever heard of Raoul Lufbery?
Absolutely.
No. Yes. Well, if you're familiar with the Lufbery Circle, it was named after him. There's some debate over whether he actually invented the circle defensive maneuver or not. Essentially, it's a group of planes get into a circle in the sky and basically protect each other's tail. So if somebody tries to attack you, they just, turn out, shoot at the person attacking, and stay in the circle. It's just a form of protection. It was good for a while until somebody discovered that if you go up and dive down on it, that you can break it apart. So, it was new tactics, and it worked for a while, and then somebody figured out how to defeat it. So, but if you've ever heard of the Lufbery Circle, that's one of the guys that was an ace. He had 16 victories in the war.
Goodness. I think that's one of the things that's so fascinating about combat aircraft and flying at this time is the tactics that were evolving. They were necessities, and I mean, sometimes the guy getting shot down didn't get to change his tactics, but because of what happened to him, suddenly they had to change maneuvers or change how they covered each other and become more aware of things like that. So the lone wolf guy, that probably was appealing, but if he got shot down, they may never know what happened to him. So having a wingman, having that protection, having that cover, having that circle defense that you were just talking about, those are all things that developed out of necessity. And, there are an awful lot of pilots that probably went down very, very early in their career and never got a chance to learn these things and adapt and adjust. But my goodness, what a time to be in the air.
Well, it sure was. Let me give you one more fact about Lufbery. When he was a commander of the 94th Squadron, they were having issues with planes crashing into each other during takeoff and landings. So he directed all approaching aircraft to circle the airfield twice before they landed. And that was just basically to make sure that they saw everything that was moving, that nobody was going to run into each other. And so what this actually did is this became the process that we know as the landing pattern. the downwind base and turn to final that, all aircraft today practice. If you go out to the airport, you'll see the plane going past the airport, turning around and coming back and landing. And that is something that this guy developed as a pilot in World War
I. Again, necessity required that kind of adjustment and adaptation, because they probably got tired of seeing people collide and be killed and, just have these accidents. So what can we do to prevent that in the future? And that's an incredible example of the pace of evolution when it comes to air combat. David, I'm looking at the pictures behind both you and I see a wooden tail skid.
Yes.
So these aircraft were operating off of grass strips.
Well, and that goes back to working the pattern. Those planes would just take off into the wind, whichever direction the wind was. So there was no runway per se like we have today in World War I. It was just a field. And so you didn't need a big wheel in the back. You just had a tail skid, just turn the plane in the direction of the wind and turn the power on and go. So that, was just a little too undisciplined, and, things got out of hand and they had to put some kind of control in place. So yeah, most of the planes of that time did have that wooden tail skid. They did not have wheels because they weren't on a runway. They were in the dirt.
And also talking about the guns, the picture that's behind me shows I think it's a 17, and it's got I believe that's called a Lewis gun up on the top wing. And that is before they had the interrupter gear. Picture, David, of your original, I think you said that was a 24 that's in a Belgian museum. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a 23, I believe.
23, okay.
Yeah, it's like the one version before. But,
Gotcha.
I don't know the history of how it came to be, but correct. That one
so
has
you could see the cowl-mounted guns there.
Correct. It has the interrupter gear in there, and so that one is mounted on the fuselage itself. The interesting thing, that Lewis gun that's mounted on top, the reason it doesn't work as a synchronized weapon is because the rate of fire is uneven. It's not, steady. It rises and falls, so the interrupter doesn't work with it. That's why they had to switch to a different gun to actually do that. So the British actually only used it on top of the wing. They never used it on the fuselage with the interrupter. So, some services, the French did, they used it with the interrupter, but the British did not.
Did not realize that.
That's just one of those little facts that, as you're reading it, you're like, oh, well, I never quite realized that, but there you go. And they're shooting a 7.7 millimeter gun. It's a Vickers model, and the Lewis gun is also a 7.7 millimeter. But the other thing I learned is, so if you've seen it mounted on top, they've got that big drum on top of the Vickers. The way that you change it is there's what they call a Foster mounting, and it's basically an L-shaped bar that you pull the gun back so that you can reach the top of it and swap out the drum and then put it back up in position. So that's how they change put more ammunition into the gun, is by using this Foster mounting that put it up on top of the wing.
And this, of course, was a single piloted aircraft, so there was not a crew member who was manning the gun who could do that for you. So it had to be accessible for the pilot to be able to change out that drum. So pulling it back would actually point the gun straight up, or pretty close to straight up as he did that, right?
Correct. And what I read is they would fly underneath other planes and shoot directly up into their belly. So it was not only, to make it easy to change ammunition, it was also used in battle that way.
Some good tactical advantage.
But one of the things we were talking about earlier is it was, many models were made. The operators, this plane was used all across the war. I've got over 20 different countries that actually used it. Belgium, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Finland, France, Guatemala, Hungary, Italy, Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Russia, Switzerland, Siam, Soviet Union, Turkey, the Ukraine, the UK, and the US. I mean, it was everywhere at the time. Everybody liked this aircraft.
I was really surprised at the South American usage and thinking about how that was exported. And I couldn't find, was that done mostly after the war? Was that an aircraft that, there were many examples available after the war and it was somewhat obsolete as a combat fighter? So it was made
Correct.
Available for export?
Yes, it became a very good trainer apparently after the war and was used up into the 1920s. So it had a long life after the war just as a trainer. Let's see, the French Aviation Maritime operated a Nieuport 21 for carrier landings in the 1920s and 21 on a converted French escort ship. So, I mean, the French were even still using it as late as 21. Another interesting thing I found, the Japanese actually bought copies of the plane and built them off of a pattern from 21 to 23 by the Nakajima company. They designated it as the KO3, and the Japanese operated them until 1926. So they actually had SPADs, which was a plane that came after the Nieuport, and they stopped using those in 22 and kept using the Nieuports until 26. So that plane had some legs, unbelievably so.
It must have been, again, thinking about how widespread and all those examples around the world in Europe and Asia and South America, the U.S., that so few examples survived. In fact, just the one original example in Belgium. You would think that somebody would have tucked one away somewhere, or had some pieces of parts, and maybe there's some parts, but nothing complete. Just one. Well,
the thing is all of these planes are basically wood, and wood deteriorates over time, and if it's not kept in a suitable place, they just fall apart. So even if you did keep one, if it was out in a open air barn or something, and weather or whatever, it wouldn't take long for the fabric to fall off and the wood to rot, and then you have nothing left other than maybe the engine.
Well, and some of those countries maybe didn't have very mature aircraft manufacturing capabilities, or folks that really could get in there and repair those the way you might need to, unless the French sold, training courses or training tools or things like that. I'm sure they were glad to export them, but they were phasing them out in their Air Force. So it wasn't like there was a continuous assembly line going on and continuing to build these things.
Yeah, and again, that's the technology aspect of it. I mean, these planes were being replaced really quickly. The SPAD that I talked about earlier was one of the planes that came along. One of the issues with the Nieuport is, so it's a very nimble, fast airplane. The planes that it was going up against later in the war, like the Albatross and the Fokker D7s, they were bigger aircraft, they were heavier aircraft, they were faster aircraft. So they couldn't maneuver as well, but when they would come diving at you, they could put heavier firepower on the plane. And, even though you could, left and right really fast, you just couldn't outrun them. And they would just wear these planes down and shoot them down. So they had to pull them from, combat and put them into the training reserves, because again, it's a very good flying airplane. It's very responsive. So it's a real good teacher. And so the plane went out of combat into training, and that's where it finished its life off at.
Goodness. You were talking about speed. What was the typical speed of a Nieuport, generally speaking?
About 100 miles an hour. 109 is what I've got for the 24 model. So not super fast, but it probably lands at maybe 20 miles an hour, 25.
So that was pretty good in 1914, but by 1918, it's been outclassed and surpassed, and
yeah, exactly.
That's why it got passed on, I suppose, to some other countries, including the U.S. I read that the U.S. was, when we were finally entering the war, we were really hoping to get those SPADs, and we got stuck with the Nieuports and made the best of it, but it wasn't the top line fighter that we were hoping for.
Well, that's when you're buying it from the French, they're going to keep the best thing for themselves and give your other folks the leftovers, what they are not using anymore. So you just make do with what you've got. The Nieuport only had a ceiling of about 20,000 feet. So, I mean, it didn't have to go very high. As a matter of fact, most of the combat I'm reading about is in the 1,000-foot range, 500 feet, 1,500 feet. So they're flying fairly low. So I'm interested to know if the reconnaissance were the only ones that would go up high and everything else was fought very low.
Sounds possible, doesn't it?
Yeah, sure does. Endurance of about 2 hours and 15 minutes. So, you've got a little bit of time. You can't fly too far, I don't guess, but with the, front lines being static, they just flew over and back and could do that multiple times a day.
Probably wasn't the most comfortable plane to be flying in. Not the open cockpit and everything. And, I don't know if these pilots were wearing parachutes regularly at this point, were they?
No, I don't think that was a regular thing until a little bit later.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I read a couple of accounts of one of the pilots was trying to adjust his gun on top of his wing and unbuckled himself, and the plane upset, flipped over, and threw him from the plane. Yeah, it was a very dangerous endeavor that they were involved in, not only from the enemy, but just flying in general.
A lot of things to pay attention to.
Well,
that doesn't change.
No, it hasn't changed today at all. It's just, technology has gone a long way to make things better, but this was when leaps and bounds were being made, and that Nieuport was really a fine plane to be out there.
Well, guys, as we're talking about the Nieuport 11, 17, and 24, let's jump into final thoughts, starting with you, Dave Gorman.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, seeing one of these flying, even though it was a replica, seeing a few of them replicas flying at an air show in Gunnersville, Alabama in 1992, it really was a beautiful aircraft. It looked great in the air. It had a really distinctive shape. I guess the rudder and everything has a great look to it. It looks fast. It isn't, as we discussed, but it still looks great in the air. And, considering how much happened around the Nieuport, it's amazing it survived as long as it did and served in so many areas as it did. So next time I'm in Dayton, I'll take a closer look at the replica up there.
Definitely.
And, man, if I get to Belgium, I know where I got to go.
Exactly. David, Rowe, final thoughts?
Yeah, exactly. It's one of a kind, so that's definitely something to go see. Again, great airplane. It's a classic look. Just like I said, it reminds me of World War I every time I see it. It's exactly what I envision the planes are. It was a great success in its day. It was well balanced. It was just used by everyone, and it's really made a name for itself. So I'm glad we had a chance to talk about it. It's a really pretty bird.
Definitely is, for sure. As we're talking about the Nieuport here on the History of Aviation podcast, let's jump into where folks can get a hold of us and our social media, starting with you, David Rowe.
I am on aerophile.com, AEROWEPHILE.com. I've got all kinds of videos on YouTube, pictures on Instagram and Facebook. I post to Twitter. So please come check me out. I've got lots to show and lots more coming to show.
Dave Gorman.
I can be found on Instagram at _it's Dave Gorman. And then also my YouTube channel is called Gormania. And as I mentioned every week, it's not always just aircraft all the time. It does have a few other things, but mostly it's that, some music as well. So come check me out there.
Definitely. And as far as the History of Aviation podcast goes, there is so many places you can find us. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We're on Patreon. We have our own website. All of our stuff is listed down below here on the podcast. And we have shirts and stickers coming. How about that, guys?
All right. Wait. Love it. Love it.
Should be great to see, and looking forward to wearing them.
Definitely. And we're gonna eventually open a merch store and get a lot of that going. We're just getting some samples and whatnot right now. But yeah, things are growing and things are going good, and I definitely appreciate you guys.
Love it. Appreciate it too. Great for everything you do.
And to our listeners, thank you so much. We hope you enjoyed it. Please do follow the History of Aviation podcast and leave some words in the comment section below. For David Rowe, Dave Gorman, I'm Derrick Beeler. Thanks for listening to the History of Aviation podcast. I messed the outro up.
You did.
And here it comes.
This is Joe Morse. You are listening to the History of Aviation podcast with Derrick Beeler, David Rowe, and David Gorman.